everyone's having a fantastic day. Today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the topic of executions in the Roman Empire. Maybe we can all learn a little bit, especially about how it connects with the early church. Executions in the Roman Empire are something that are incredibly important to our Christian faith. Because if it wasn't for executions in the Roman Empire, Jesus would have never been brought on a cross. Now, the events that happened on Good Friday are incredibly important and unique for us as Christians, and the fact that Jesus was crucified is important to us. But it's not unique for the Roman Empire. During the reign of the Roman Empire, they executed quite likely millions of people, which was an astonishing number for the time, considering the city of Rome only had about 1 million residents, and it was by far the largest city in the world. Which brings us to the reason why Rome executed so many people. Unlike today, executions were not done as a form of punishment. They were seen as a way to maintain order. Rome grew so quickly, in part because of its society's strict social structure. Roman citizens were at the top, especially males, then female citizens, everyone else, and in the very bottom were slaves. They maintained their society by maintaining this order. People were executed when they made steps to break down the order of society. One of the craziest things you could see that make this whole thing fit together was the way that they executed people in society who killed their father, or people who committed patricide. Because of the hierarchical nature of Roman society, with older male citizens at the top, if you killed your father or your grandfather, it was seen as one of the worst things, if not the worst thing you could do. Therefore, they came up with the harshest punishment they could imagine for people who committed this crime. This was hopefully a way that people could be a deterrent so that other people wouldn't do the crime and this crime wouldn't happen in the first place. But what they do is they put the person who killed their father in a leather sack with an assortment of live animals, a dog, a snake, a monkey, a rooster, each having its own symbolic meaning about family life and about this crime. They would then throw the whole sack into the water, where the victim would be torn by these wild animals as they drowned to death. It was clearly not a good way to go, and if someone were to see this execution, they would hopefully be swayed away from trying to kill their own father. This harsh punishment was enacted in order to keep Roman order. How Roman executions were used to keep this order is even more visible in Roman mass executions. Mass executions were often used after Rome put down a rebellion in a province somewhere in their empire. Two examples of around Jesus' life of these rebellions come the first in 73 to 71 BC, when there was a slave rebellion led by Spartacus. These slaves were trying to redo the social order since they were at the very bottom. Unfortunately, they lost, and afterwards, 6,000 of these rebel slaves were crucified in a line from the Appian Way to Rome. Again, these sort of mass executions can be seen in 70 AD, after the fall of Jerusalem, when the Jewish people revolted. There, several thousand Jewish people were publicly executed by the Roman order. These are both examples of people who were executed for trying to subvert something in Roman society, whether it's slavery in the case of Spartacus, or with the Jewish people, it was Roman rule over what they felt like was their God-given land. In both cases, Roman officials acted swiftly to execute people, not only so that people wouldn't commit the crimes, the people who died, but also as a reminder to people, whether they're slaves or Jewish people living in Israel, of what would happen if they tried to rebel. For the ancient Romans, capital punishment was a method of maintaining order and their social order in their empire. The execution had very little to do with the person sentenced to death. If you had the good fortune of being born a Roman citizen, you would probably assume that you'd be treated with respect and dignity, even if you did commit a crime. But if you were a slave or a prisoner of war, you would expect the full force of Roman law and authority to be thrown at you, so that both you and any others thinking of disobedience would come to understand that rebellion and crime were not to be tolerated. This difference in the way that Roman citizens were treated versus others can clearly be seen in the Bible and in the early church. Peter was crucified, while Paul was beheaded. Crucifixion was seen as one of the lowest forms of execution. Not only was it painful, but their body would often be left on the cross for display for weeks. Not that their death often had dignity to it, but this sort of death doesn't have any dignity at all. That's why Peter was crucified, as well as Jesus. They were not Roman citizens, and therefore they did not require a dignified death. Paul, on the other hand, was born a Roman citizen. It states this in Acts chapter 22, verse 28. In fact, in this verse, Paul uses his Roman citizenship as a way to immediately get out of jail. The commander had put him in jail before he found out he was guilty. But when this commander found out that Paul was a Roman citizen, he immediately had Paul released, before his interrogation even. Execution and punishment was built around order and social structure, and since Paul was a male Roman citizen, he was at the top of the social order in Jerusalem. Which is why, when Paul eventually was executed, they chose to behead him, because it was seen as a more dignified way to die. It was a way a Roman citizen could be treated highly and with reverence given to his social order, while still a punishment could be carried out. The beheading wasn't meant to be a warning to others on who others might try to do what Paul did. It wasn't. It was seen as a very humane way to end someone's life. As crazy as that sounds. Even in Jesus' own execution, we can see some of the inner workings of the Roman bureaucratic structure, especially on its relationship with capital punishment. As we talked about, the Romans used executions, especially crucifixions, as a way to maintain their social control and maintain their traditions. But Jesus really wasn't doing much to harm Roman society. He was a traveling preacher who focused mainly on the Jewish people. In about 40 years from Jesus' death, the Jewish people are going to revolt against Rome. But the Romans alive at that time did not know that in 40 years the Jewish people would revolt. They thought it could happen at any moment. Jewish people in Israel back then did not like being under control of the Roman Empire. Israel and Jerusalem and Judah in particularly was a province that was notoriously hard to control. With this in mind, not only did Rome send their governor to oversee the territory, they also allowed for a number of local kings in the Herod dynasty to have some control over the land. Mark Antony was the first Roman emperor who used Herod to help him control Jerusalem. After Mark Antony fell in battle to Octavian, who would later become Augustus, Herod surrendered himself to Augustus, who had just won control over the Roman Empire. Augustus, realizing, like Mark Antony, the trouble with maintaining the Jewish people and their social order there, he kept Herod as a client king under his rule in Jerusalem. After Herod passed away, his family continued to control the areas around Jerusalem in subdivided sections. However, all of these kings shared power with a Roman governor who was also given control over the same area. Now, I know that it kind of seems like I'm chasing a butterfly off in left field right now, especially considering our topic of Roman executions. But there's an interesting point in Luke chapter 23, verses 7 through 15, where Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, a Jewish client king, and his court. This was during Jesus' trial. As we discussed before, the Romans had no love for the Jewish people, and Jesus seemed to be stirring up the Jewish people and not really messing around with the Roman Empire. Jesus told people to pay their taxes to Caesar, and Jesus seemed to be speaking of more of a spiritual revolution than inspiring people to take up torches and pitchforks. Pontius Pilate probably didn't see any upside to executing Jesus. He wasn't harming Roman order, and it just kind of seemed like more of a Jewish thing to him than a Roman one. The Gospel of John really delves into this concept, but here in Luke, we have this time when Pontius Pilate just handed Jesus over to Herod Antipas, hoping that Herod, being a more Jewish than Pilate, would just take care of it for him, which is about as historically accurate as you can get. In ancient times, as much as in our society today, governmental bureaucrats don't like making hard decisions, especially those that could be controversial and don't really have an upside. Pontius Pilate handed Jesus over to Herod Antipas as a way to say, here, you deal with this and get this off my plate for me, please. He probably was very upset when Herod Antipas did the same thing and handed Jesus back to Pilate. In truth, Pontius Pilate was probably right to be leery about executing Jesus. It didn't help him control the Jewish people. I mean, in the matter of less than a generation, they were in full-out revolt. And, likewise, it didn't help secure the traditional society of Rome. In fact, depending on who you ask, Jesus' death and resurrection were the reason for the end of traditional Roman society. Because while Jesus may not have spoken out against Rome, many of his followers began to change the very fundamental building blocks of Roman society. In Roman society, there was the idea of mos memorum. This was an unwritten social code that guided Rome. It was this very order of society, this mos memorum, and it was an important part, especially with their religion and the worship of their emperor as a god, and the worship of their other gods and the basic founding myths of Rome. Their religion helped tie them together as an empire, and the many different people together as one. So, when Christians came and, like Jews, asked to not have to follow the rules, they asked to not be part of the empirical cult. It caused several red flags, because unlike Jews, Christians didn't have their traditions to lean on. The Jewish people had been around for a long time, as long as Roman historians could tell. Christians, however, had been around barely any time at all. In fact, most historians didn't even write about them. They would have been asking to break with traditions and have them not worship the emperor with nothing to fall back on. So, when things started going wrong, people blamed Christians for breaking the fundamental social covenant found in their unwritten codes, the mos memorum. This is clearly seen in the reign of Diocletian, who was an emperor, and he did a lot to modernize Rome. He made them run better, made them better fed, and after several generations of poor emperors, he is often seen as a good leader. But he also did lead a persecution against the Christians, which is a little ironic because the word diocese comes from his name. He divided the empire into small dioceses so they could be run on a more local scale with his overarching hand guiding everything. Now, diocese is the same word that is used by the Catholic Church today. They apply it in the same sort of governmental way that Diocletian did so long ago, where all these little sections can work all under the authority of the church. So here we have one of the greatest persecutors of Christians in history, whose name is now attached to the fundamental organization of the church for centuries. For all of his accomplishments, Diocletian is most known for something that he would have hated. But even Diocletian wasn't guided by a blind hatred for Christians. For many years, he was very soft on Christians. But he signed the first edict against Christians in 303 AD. He signed it after he was convinced by one of his local officials, Galerius, that Christians and eunuchs plotted together to burn down part of his palace. Even though they had a thorough investigation that took place and found no such evidence for a plot. It didn't matter. To Diocletian, something needed to happen because people believed that they had done something. So in order to maintain order, he had to take action. And that's what needed to be fixed for him at that moment. This led to a mass roundup and execution of archbishops and the burning down of several newly built Christian churches. However, the executions here were never quite at the same level that we saw earlier with the rebellions of Spartacus or the Jewish rebellion. For all but the highest ranking Christians, the bishops and archbishops, the rest, they were just offered the ability to pour out a small amount of wine at an altar of the emperor, and if they did so, they'd face basically no consequences. And many Christians poured out the small amount of wine and went about their lives, many of which still were Christians. The number of Christians who died during these executions were so small because it wasn't so much about showing force of Rome as it was Rome trying to correct this ill of society and their citizens' bad behavior. It was their bad beliefs that were against Roman traditions and against what the emperor saw as the society of Rome. However, even his official Galerius realized that the executions were doing the exact opposite of what they hoped to. The martyrs of the church were actually fueling Christian fever, not taking it away. By 311 AD, the edict against the Christians had been completely revoked because the executions were not having the desired effect. They were not bringing more order to the empire or the emperor. They were instead sowing more chaos, which is the last thing you want if you were in the bureaucracy of Rome. Small-scale executions of Christians did continue until Constantine became the emperor. Now, Constantine legalized Christianity and even was baptized on his deathbed. For the most part, after that, after Constantine's conversion and the rise of Christianity, Christianity was seen as part of the traditions of Rome, and therefore not a reason for executions at all. To sum it all up, in general, we can see that executions in Rome were a way to maintain order. Rome did last as long as it did, in part because of its heavy focus on social traditions and how it maintained them. They did not like it when people tried to do something different than what the emperor had always done, the empire had always done. We can see that in the structuring of society and the differences in executions that took place in the early church. How some of the apostles were treated very well, and how others were treated quite poorly. We can see how Christians were persecuted heavily when they were seen as going against the traditions of Rome, and then how those executions were lifted as soon as they became part of society, even though Constantine by no means stopped executing people. He just stopped executing Christians for being Christians. I've hoped you've enjoyed this brief historical study on executions in the Roman Empire and how they connect with the early Christians and the early church.